Have you ever heard of the term garbage in versus garbage out? And this term is very common, very old when it has to do with computers. And the idea of it is that if you've got bad data or bad input coming in to a program, to a piece of software, you can expect bad things or unexpected things to happen on the output side of that program. Well, PLCs are no different. Basically what they are is they're a piece of hardware, and inside the PLC you have a computer program that's running that's dependent on the input data that's coming in from the real world. So in this episode, which is a part of a series that I'm doing on PLCs, we're going to be looking specifically at the inputs. We're going to start with the inputs, and we're going to identify the different classes of inputs. And fortunately, there's two most common, and that's going to be digital and analog, and we're going to get into what those are in a few minutes. And we're also going to take a look at the types of inputs that you'll have within the two classes. So in this particular episode, I'm going to actually take three different types of inputs, both digital and analog, and we're going to share what those are and kind of give you an idea real world what those things look like. And then we're going to go into how to troubleshoot these things. When you find a PLC, or let's say you find a piece of mechanical equipment that's not behaving like it should, you've done all your normal checks on the mechanical side, refrigeration, and all things are pointing at the PLC. Well, one of the first things that you want to do is you want to make sure that the input data that is coming into the PLC is correct. And I'm going to just tell you just from experience, guys, most of the time if you have a PLC that's misbehaving, all things being equal, it's usually something on the input side that's feeding incorrect data to the PLC that actually causes the malfunction. So we're going to be taking a look at that, and I'm super excited to share this information with you. A little preview is if you haven't had a chance to check out the episode that I did on the hopscotch method, you might want to check that out because the diagnostic portion that we're going to get to in this episode is going to be covering an ohm meter. Basically, we're going to be looking at resistance, specifically to thermistors, and we're also going to be looking at analog inputs, and that's going to be very helpful to understand the hopscotch electrical diagnostic method that I covered pretty well in a prior episode. So you might want to check that out. It'll be really helpful as we proceed to this particular episode. And a couple of updates. If you're checking out this preview of this episode on one of the social platforms, we will always provide you with a link that will jump you directly over to this episode on the processchilleracademy.com website. Once you land there, you can check out this full episode in video format as well as audio only. And keep in mind that all of our podcast content is always 100% free. Before you make the jump over to this episode, please consider clicking the like button on whatever platform that you're on. It's very helpful, as you probably know, and I know you've been asked this a million times. It helps tweak the algorithms a little bit, and it helps get the word out to more people. Well, that's it. I really appreciate checking this preview out, and I'm looking forward to seeing you over on the processchilleracademy.com website, and hope you get great value out of this episode.